Data protection and privacy teams are under more pressure than ever with new laws, AI oversight, data breaches, and the constant expectation to do more with fewer resources.
That's why TrustArc built a modern privacy and data protection management platform powered by Arc Intelligence. It unifies your tools, automates the work that slows you down, and surfaces what matters most right when you need it.
From guided quick actions to our intelligent assistant, Ask Arc, you get credible, contextual answers backed by expert research, not generic AI guesses.
Finally, privacy that works the way privacy pros work.
Learn how TrustArc helps teams move faster with confidence at trustarc.com/serious-privacy. That's trustarc.com/serious-privacy.
This is Serious Privacy by TrustArc. Here are your hosts, Paul Breitbart and Kay Royal.
There are not a lot of people who have been in privacy and data protection for as long as our guest today. Marty Abrams, the Executive Director and Chief Strategist of the Information Accountability Foundation, has over 35 years of experience as an information and consumer policy innovator. Multi-stakeholder collaboration has been a key for him in developing practical solutions to dilemmas in information policy. The IAF, among other things, has prepared reports on trustworthy people-beneficial data activity, fair and ethical data processing, as well as many draft model privacy laws for countries including the United States around the world. I'm not completely sure that 1 minute of podcasting per year that Marty has been working in our field will do justice to all of his work, but let's at least make a start and see where we get. My name is Paul Breitbart.
And I'm Kay Royal, and welcome to Serious Privacy. So, Marty, we've known each other for a while. Welcome to the show. We absolutely love having you here. And thank you so much for joining us.
Well, it's my pleasure.
And we have, as everyone knows, the unexpected question coming, and there's absolutely no way to prepare for it. And the unexpected question today, and you don't have to violate privacy to do this, is what was your last credit card purchase?
My last credit card purchase was at the grocery store on Sunday, and it was Danish for people who came early for the Sunday football game. So the last purchase was at Bel Air Food Store, and it was on Sunday.
Love the level of detail.
Nice. I like it. Getting back to the basics. Food. Paul, what about you?
Well, guess what? It was food. Obviously. I actually used my credit card to pay for a restaurant on Saturday night because last week, finally here in the Netherlands, the restaurants reopened again. So it was a good moment to go back to a restaurant, have a proper lengthy meal with friends. And yeah, then the credit card is useful to pay.
And Kay, the unexpected question is, who did you root for on Sunday?
Oh, 49ers.
Too bad.
Because I used to live in the Bay Area, and I met several football players at the apartments that we lived at, one in particular that I really liked. So he was cool. But
for those of us non-Americans, can you explain what the hell you are talking about?
We're working up to the Super Bowl. So there's two divisions in American football. And so they're going through their championships. And this past weekend was the one to decide who's going to the Super Bowl. So the top in this championship and the top in this one. And I was rooting for the San Francisco 49ers. Marty, who were you rooting for? The other division I didn't care about.
So I actually was rooting for Cincinnati to go to the Super Bowl because it would be interesting.
Yeah.
And I like to see someone different. In the 49ers-Rams game, put it this way, I had a house full of children under 5 wearing 49er T-shirts.
It was a California show, so both the Rams and the 49ers are in California. One's northern, one's southern, so that was interesting. But I'll finish out that my last credit card purchase would not surprise anyone who listens to the podcast. I bought stuff for my pageant.
Fantastic.
I don't remember if the last one was the craft supplies to make the gifts that you give to all the other queens, or if it was a dress. I don't remember which one actually went through last, but it was pageant stuff. Because I go in 2 weeks.
Wow.
So, in 2 weeks, yay, yeah, oh, there we go.
And where are you going this year?
Vegas. So I say they always hold it in Vegas, but this is only their 4th year. And last year, because of COVID, they had to hold it in San Antonio, which y'all may recall, I got iced in and there was no power and no water. And people were going down to the Riverwalk in San Antonio and filling up their garbage buckets with water so they could flush the commodes. Yeah. Whole bunch of pageant queens, plus a whole bunch of medical personnel, plus they had moved a nursing home population in there. So it was crazy. And I'll give a shout out to one of TrustArc's customers, HEB Grocery. I called my privacy contact there, and they actually came down and served a meal to the entire hotel staff. And yes, absolutely amazing. So, okay, back to the topic of the day. We have Marty, and if people out there don't know Marty, Paul gave a fabulous introduction to him, but if you're in privacy, you need to know who Marty is.
Here.
You also need to know who the IAF is. So we'll give you links to that to make sure you can, but we agreed that we would guarantee a starting question for Marty, but then the conversation will take us where we go. So, Marty, there's a lot happening in the world for privacy. I mean, everywhere you look, there's something happening for privacy. There's also much more happening that violates privacy. But let's see if we can focus in on one of the biggest things happening right now, the UK and their GDPR.
So just yesterday, the government announced that they were going to have their bill to really to mine the benefits of Brexit. And part of that is a reform in their general data protection regulation. And as you'll recall, last year, the UK's appropriate ministry put a consultation out on changes that they thought should be made to the GDPR. And some of the most important changes are those changes that would facilitate artificial intelligence and other advanced analytics. Artificial intelligence and advanced analytics are both based on the ability to really reuse data for either private sector research or scientific research, which are different. We talked about private sector research as knowledge creation. And it's increasingly hard to do that under the way privacy laws are structured and the way consumer rights as it relates to privacy laws are structured. So trying to find a legal basis, for example, in Europe, and Paul knows this all too well, trying to find a legal basis in Europe in which you can do the discovery of what are the important insights that are predictive is just getting increasingly difficult to do under the GDPR. And that's not going to stop. There are places in the GDPR where you could fix it, for example, Article 989 type legislation. But these issues are going to first be confronted in the UK and are going to be confronted as part of this GDPR reform. So there are a lot of companies in the UK who are dependent on transfers of data from Europe to the UK, done under adequacy, and that adequacy is dependent on the UK GDPR being pretty much a carbon copy of the European GDPR. As UK migrates that, it brings into question adequacy. And for a number of companies, that's a scary proposition.
Yeah.
It absolutely is. And that is one of the reasons why I would not be in favor of the UK going their own way while so embedded in the European economy, but rather to see if they can work with the European member states, especially when it comes to AI and machine learning and training data sets and using more data for research purposes. I think everybody who is in privacy here in Europe, or many people at least, will agree that we need to do better when it comes to offering training data, creating training data, and certainly also when getting data for research purposes.
Right. Very touchy subject.
To have that as a specific legal basis for collecting personal data, I'm still not convinced that is a wise idea. I'd rather see it as a reuse possibility within strict boundaries, but certainly not for the UK to go at it alone. And this might be one of the less risky elements of the proposals of the UK government when it comes to their adequacy.
So there are good things in the consultation and there are bad things.
Right.
And the IF responded to that consultation. And, for example, the infringement on the independence of the regulator, I think, is a concern, and it is a problem. That one of the things they want to fix is legitimate interest. As everybody who's trying to use legitimate interest in Europe knows, using legitimate interest as a legal basis is just incredibly difficult. But
incredibly common.
But incredibly difficult. If you look at the precedents coming out of advertising, you can't do data science under legitimate interest because it's complex, and people can't understand it, and they can't exercise their right to object. This is a precedent that is incredibly important as you look at the AI regulations. The AI regulation in Europe looks very comforting. It's got traditional industrial policy type aspects to it, but it's clear that you have to clear the hurdles of the GDPR before you get to the AI regulation. You have to have...
Paul and I discussed their guidance on AI when it came out. I was sorely disappointed at how far they did not go. I wanted to see more, but...
Well, so when we commented on... we actually don't think the assessment processes in the AI regulation were stringent enough. And because they're not stringent enough, you then have to have the assessment process as part of the privacy or data protection analysis. And how those laws are going to work together and how the regulators are going to work together is a problem. As you know, the Commission has expressed disappointment in how well the Data Protection Board is functioning or not functioning. That's become a concern. Axel Voss did an excellent paper last year raising issues about how you do innovation under the GDPR. Now, admittedly, he's in the minority, but the fact is he raised significant issues that have to be considered. The GDPR was written as a law that was supposed to last for 20 years. I'm not sure that it can make that 20-year term.
How long do you think it's going to last? Is it going to last long enough for the U.S. to get something to put another shield?
Well, we could talk about so privacy. Okay, I think that legislating is difficult. I think
that's a good way to put it.
I think the GDPR is going to be in effect for at least another 5 years, at the minimum. I think that there are going to be numerous variations on transfer mechanisms from Europe to the United States, or from Europe to the United States, and I think that sort of the simplicity of safe harbor when it was developed 20 years ago is not going to be part of whatever device comes out. I think it's going to be a device that's going to be limited. The fact that we haven't had an agreement yet is problematic. I think every time that the data protection authorities talk about possibility rather than likelihood of data being interesting to national security agencies, it becomes harder and harder to reach that final agreement.
I agree.
Yes, I think that's fair.
Yeah, I don't see a lot of discussion over the risk of the data itself.
And I think that so I was around when the original directive was written, and I remember, but I was around when the directive was written, and the directive originally had the language of equivalency for transfers out of Europe. Politically, it was changed to adequacy. Adequacy was seen as an outcomes-based concept rather than a process concept. When the Working Party 29 began to discuss transfers, it became sort of equivalency light. And when the European Court of Justice began to weigh in, it became equivalency. I think that's a real problem for transfers. I think that there's going to be new interoperability discussions around the world. Part of what's going to come out of the UK is this concept of what is interoperability and what are the elements of interoperability. I'm looking
forward to that.
I think the concept of probability on outcomes is going to be a bigger piece of discussion. And before we started broadcast, I talked about the precautionary principle as problematic in the way laws are being interpreted in Europe. And this is one of those cases where the precautionary principle, the fear that something might happen rather than the probability of something happening, has had an effect.
Yeah. Paul, thoughts?
Yeah, I think Marty is to some extent right, that it is becoming more and more difficult to find an agreement. At the same time, I'm not seeing an easy way out for the European Union here because of our fundamental rights treaties, and not just the European Union, also the Council of Europe Convention 108, which we, of course, celebrated last week with Data Protection Day. The case law that we have is a given now, just like precedent would work in the US. It's not so easily overturned.
Right.
And that means that any solution, at least in the shorter term, that we find will need to meet this interpretation of the fundamental rights protection on the European side of the Atlantic, which for international data transfers for sure becomes a problem. But I think one of the ways out would actually indeed be looking at the likelihood of risk, and the data protection authorities so far seem very reluctant to do so, even if you look at the Google Analytics case, for example, or just earlier this week, a court decision, I believe it was in Munich, also on Google Fonts, which is now also deemed controversial if it is embedded in a website. So yes, the likelihood, in my view, and that's no surprise, should absolutely play a much bigger role than it does now when it comes to risk assessments.
So there's a political process that inevitably will take place, and trying to predict when that political process will take place is hard to do. But it goes to the question of the full range of fundamental rights and interests. The law speaks to the full range of fundamental rights. The IAF, in all of our work, think about the full range of fundamental rights, not just the right to a secluded space, not just the right to control how one is identified or labeled, but the full range of fundamental rights. And one of the things that's going to push that political discussion, of course, is the fact that we now have to figure out how we're long-term going to live with a pandemic, and the likelihood that it will continue to morph and change, and we're going to have to be able to share data for research, share data for travel, share data for coming up with new protocols for how life can function. The other is that we're entering another Cold War era, and that Cold War era means that national security agencies are going to be looking for new signals, and those signals are going to be related to the fundamental right to live in a safe society. So there's going to be political pressure, and courts are not immune to that political pressure over time. They're will begin to read the conventional wisdom. That's not an overnight process, but I think it's a process that will start soon.
I hope so. At the same time, this is not just a process where the solution should come from the European side, at least not in my view. And I think, right. I hope you agree that also from the side of government interference anywhere in the world, not just in the US, some sort of step should be made to also make government access to personal data more accountable, more transparent. Of course, bearing in mind that we are dealing with national security, but there are ways to make all of this more verifiable, more transparent, and more human rights compliant.
Absolutely, and that's why the off again, on again process at the OECD to come up with a set of principles related to accountability when the government demands data from the private sector is so important. That on again, off again, it's last couple of years it's been on again, off again. Hopefully it's on again. Yeah. But it's not a new idea.
This is the Japanese initiative, right? Lately,
as both of you know, right? But we actually talked about this at the International Conference of Data Protection and Privacy Commissioners before it became the Global Privacy Assembly in Morocco back in about 4 years ago, and there was a discussion on the fact that we needed
2018, I think
2018, and we talked about the fact that there should be a discussion, a global agreement on how you create an accountability chain when data flows from the private sector to the government. We started that process in a discussion that Jennifer Stoddard, the former Canadian commissioner, chaired back in 2013, 2014. So it takes a while for these things to work, but that before you can get an international treaty, you have to have an international agreement on what accountability means when governments request that data. And as we think about this whole question of governments and data and free expression and over-observation, think about the Olympics start this Thursday, and think about the environment in which this Olympics is being held.
Right.
And
on a lot of fronts.
On absolutely a lot of fronts. But the fact is that the Chinese government has very strong feelings about who should have control over data. And it's not the individual and it's not the organization. Nope. It's the state that should have that control.
Right.
So, Marty, one of the things that always fascinates me about the IAF is the work you're doing in drafting model legislation, and not just once, but multiple iterations, and trying to push it in the most positive sense of speaking, push it with legislators around the world to show them what good privacy and data protection legislation could look like. Can you tell us a bit more about those projects?
So we drafted the Fair and Open Use Act, which is model legislation for the United States, but it has elements that are useful other places. So on the IAF website, it is based on the concept of beginning to define the responsibility of organizations to be responsible and answerable in a very robust fashion. The first definition in this draft law is a definition of adverse processing impact, and it's got 10 components. And as we think about the process of educating lawmakers to how you think about privacy legislation that is fit for 2030, we think it's important at this point in time to go back to the basics and say, what is the purpose of privacy legislation? And the purpose of privacy legislation has got to be something that is actionable by organizations and coverable by regulators. And so we want folks to start with the sense of what is this definition of adverse processing impact? How do I bring that definition forward? How do I say that what I'm trying to prevent is adverse processing impact? Some of this is the overcollection of data. The collection of data is a processing in itself. But much of it has to do with the fair application of that data. So if people want to sort of say, what are the stones to creating the next generation of legislation? One starts with, what are our intended outcomes? What are the things we're trying to prevent? What are the things we're trying to encourage? That's why those definitions are so important. Then one says, how is it that organizations are supposed to act on that? So you create a model of what a risk assessment might look like based on this concept of adverse processing impact. Then you say, what is it that the regulators might oversee in terms of this process of governing adverse processing impact as seen through a risk assessment? And then everything else becomes add-ons to that process. The Fair and Open Use Act builds on the concept of legitimate, legal basis to process. That's a key point of the GDPR. But it starts with 11 such legitimate uses of data. So it's a much more granular piece of legislation. Not all of it is right, but because it's based on this concept of legal legitimate uses, it then becomes interoperable with the GDPR and GDPR type legislation. So part of it is you can't process data without a legitimate use. There are 11 legitimate uses. Scientific research, for example, is one of those legitimate uses. Knowledge creation is another. So the idea is, first, let's get folks talking about what are our objectives for privacy legislation. How do we make them actionable by organizations and by regulators? And then how do we create the guidance for organizations to do it with competency and honesty? And I believe if you start with this concept of what is the problem we're trying to solve, what are the behaviors we're trying to discourage, the behaviors we're trying to encourage, that becomes the basis not just for privacy legislation in the United States, it becomes the basis for privacy legislation in Canada, for example,
right.
which is going to be revising its legislation, or the UK, where they're going to be revising the GDPR, and in 5 years when Europe begins to revise the GDPR.
Right.
It's the perfect ideal, Marty, but I'm not sure that the legislator will start with the end goal in mind.
Oh, man, I've been doing this for a long time. I remember writing language for legislation back in 15 years ago and having a Senate staffer say to me, "You're talking about data stewardship." And I said, "Yep, I'm talking about data stewardship." And he says, "I can explain consent to a senator. I can't explain data stewardship to a senator." Well, if we want the benefits of an information age, but we also want space for us to define ourselves, we've got to be able to talk about concepts like data stewardship.
And Marty, I think there's this very clear picture of me standing on the mountain, of you standing on the mountain with 2 tablets in your hands with the 10 rules that we must follow for data stewardship. If I was an artist, I would draw that.
Well, put it this way, you're giving me too much credit. The fact is that we at the IAF listen to others and begin to try to put the pieces together. The IAF is an organization that believes in collaboration. It's an organization that believes all the stakeholders should have a voice. And that's business, that's civil society, that's people who are absolutely crazy, it's academics. But everybody has got to understand sort of what are the basic building blocks. So you'd have to know what you're trying to prevent. You need to know what you're trying to encourage. You need to know how it's actionable by people. You need to know how you deal with discrimination. All of those are pieces of that legislative pie.
Yeah.
And Paul, to your point, when we look at state legislation in the United States, it always falls back on this concept of data subject rights. And if you give individuals the ability to see what organizations are doing and have some level of control, that will begin to regulate the market. Fact is, that the market's too complicated. The fact is that people are too busy. The fact is that technologies change so fast. You need something different than the concept of individual control. Yeah. That's where Alan Weston started back in 1967. And the world has changed since 1967.
Just slightly.
It has. And the companies that are using the data, and I don't necessarily mean collecting the data, they're gathering it. They don't want to share everything they're doing with the data, much less let people know all the data they know about them.
So the fact is that transparency is important whether people understand what's there. Because transparency is one of the major tools that regulators use to understand if an organization is acting with integrity and acting with competence. So the concept of secret collections of data is abhorrent to multiple fundamental rights. So transparency is not just about people being in a position of control. Transparency is beneficial just because it's transparency.
Yeah. And as my girls asked when they were teenagers, how do you possibly provide a notice to people when people don't read the notice? Is notice really notice? And it's like, how else are you going to tell people other than telling them? They just won't read it.
Well, put this way, I have been known to read privacy notices.
Oh, yeah. We're all in the club of we read them.
No, I don't read everyone, but I read some of them. And I can tell you, and I'm not dumb, and I find it hard to parse the uses and flows of data in many of the privacy notices. And the fact is, we expect things to work. When I plug in a PC, I'm expecting that the electricity will come on, the batteries will charge, that I'll be able to use that equipment and it won't catch fire just because I plugged it in. Those
are some pretty basic expectations, Marty. I like it.
But you should have the same expectation when it comes to your data.
Absolutely, Paul. So the concept is that organizations have to act in a responsible and answerable way. That is the basic definition of accountability that we came up with in the Global Accountability Dialogue in 2009. It's the basic concept that drove the Canadian guidance in 2012. It's what led to the reform in the Singapore law in 2020. This is not this is not rocket science. It really isn't. We just have to free ourselves from old concepts and think about what are the rules and what they should be in 2030.
Right. Not rocket science. That's a great note to end on.
No, it's not rocket science, but also maybe get away from so many words, those very lengthy privacy notices that nobody reads, and let's everybody become a bit more creative and use visuals, use icons, use cartoons, use video, use song and dance for my part. I mean, do something creative to provide notice in a way that people actually start watching it. We've seen it. I've said it before. We've seen it in the airline industry. The very boring security presentations on what to do if you crash land an airplane. People stop watching and they just continue reading their book or talking to each other. And if the airlines make something fun about it,
like Southwest,
like for example, New Zealand Airlines did a few years ago with The Hobbit, then suddenly people start watching because it's fun.
So I led the multi-layered notice project back 20 years ago, literally 20 years ago. And it came up with the simplified notice that was like a food label notice. And we agreed up front there could only be 6 boxes because people can handle 6 concepts. And we said things like, we don't have to mention data security because that's a given. Every organization should keep data secure. The bloat around notices has gotten ridiculous. We also had a discussion around 2006 that couldn't we build out logic that would say, what is it the person is asking for, and be able to center on the issues most important to that particular consumer at that point of time when they ask the question. And rather than present a long notice, we present we answer the question that's front and center, and we use predictive sciences to do this. That's never happened. Part of it is, the question of deception. Are you hiding data from the individual when you do that? Part of it is we just haven't dedicated ourselves to coming up with creative solutions, as Paul said. And we have to. I tried to encourage the Global Privacy Assembly to take up this issue of supplemental information for transparency in 2021. That did not happen. I'm hopeful that at some point we will actually have a meaningful, lengthy discussion and say that notices serve or transparency serves its own purpose. Let's divorce the concept of letting people understand things from the concept of people need to make choices they don't understand.
That sounds very fair. Marty, maybe as a final question before we wrap up, in all of these years that you have been working on information policy and privacy and data protection, what is the nicest thing you've ever done? Where did you have the most fun?
So I led the global accountability dialogue, and it was the global accountability dialogue that was the first time we brought in civil society, regulators, governments, and business to define what the concept or the principle of accountability meant. And that dialogue first met in 2009. It met in Dublin in a room we called the Galway room because we were supposed to meet in Galway but didn't. And it came up with the essential elements of accountability. Those essential elements of accountability became the basis for Canadian guidance on accountability. They became the basis for reform and accountability principle at the OECD. They became the basis for guidance in Colombia and Hong Kong and Australia. The elements of that guidance were distributed throughout the GDPR, but not in one spot, requiring a comprehensive privacy program. But what made that project so satisfying was the fact that all of the parties were there together to come up with a definition for what it means to be accountable. And the concepts in the global accountability dialogue are what triggered this concept of accountability in modern data protection. And it was a true full stakeholder dialogue that led to those essential elements. That's what I'm most proud of.
Wonderful. Kay, any final questions from you?
No, I can't think of anything. Marty has been one of my privacy superheroes for a long time, so I enjoy any opportunity I have to sit and chat and learn some of his wisdom, and I'm glad we've had the opportunity to bring that to our listeners.
Marty, thank you for...
Telling you, Moses on the mountain, Marty.
Absolutely. Thank you for being with us today, Marty. And for all of our listeners, this concludes another episode of Serious Privacy. If you like us, please rate and review us in your favorite podcast app or on your favorite podcast platform. If you have any questions or suggestions, reach out to us via seriousprivacy@trustarc.com or info@seriousprivacy.eu. Reach out on Twitter via @podcastprivacy or to K, Heart of Privacy, or myself, Europol B. Find us on LinkedIn as Serious Privacy or anywhere else in the world. We are just Serious Privacy. Until our next episode, goodbye.
Bye, y'all.
That was Serious Privacy.
If you're a data protection or privacy professional, you already know the pressure. Non-stop regulatory change, AI oversight, internal demands, and the expectation to somehow stay ahead of it all. And the old patchwork of tools just isn't cutting it anymore.
No. That's why TrustArc created a modern privacy management platform powered by Arc Intelligence. The TrustArc platform brings your workflows, evidence, research, tasks, and applications all together in one unified and intelligent workspace so you don't waste time digging, clicking, or context switching.
With Ask Arc, your privacy assistant, you can ask plain language questions about laws, jurisdictions, or even your own program data and get credible, cited answers based on NIMBY research and more than 1,000 global laws. It's explainable, transparent, and purpose-built for data protection and privacy.
So if you need to add a vendor, create a cookie banner, or start an assessment, quick actions take formally complex tasks, turn them into bite-sized guided workflows to save you time.
It's a platform that thinks like you, works like you, and helps you move faster with confidence, whether you're a seasoned DPO or you're just getting started.
See how modern privacy gets done. Explore Arc at trustarc.com/serious-privacy. That's trustarc.com/serious-privacy.